Welcome to this journey into the darkest corners of forgotten American history. I'm your host, and this is a place where we unearth the stories that time tried to bury, where we examine the uncomfortable truths hidden beneath layers of dust and silence. Before we begin, I'd like to know, where are you watching this from, and what time is it where you are? Drop a comment below. There's something uniquely haunting about sharing these stories across time zones, knowing that somewhere, someone is listening to this tale in the dead of night, while others hear it in broad daylight. It reminds us that darkness exists regardless of the hour. Today, we travel back to April 1921, to the scorching plains of Travis County, Texas, a time when the First World War had ended just 3 years prior, leaving the nation grappling with returning soldiers, economic uncertainty, and a social order that remained brutally rigid, especially in the rural South. This is the story of Blackwood Farm, a modest cotton and livestock operation that sat isolated among endless stretches of dried earth and merciless sun. And this is the story of what happened when oppression, suffering, and rage finally reached a breaking point. On the morning of April 23, 1921, Sheriff Coleman Burke received a frantic call from a neighboring property owner stating that something terrible had occurred at the Blackwood place. When authorities arrived at the farm, they found the main house undisturbed, the fields silent, and the livestock still in their pens. But Nathaniel Blackwood, the 48-year-old owner of the property, was nowhere to be found. What they discovered instead would haunt Travis County for generations. In the eastern corner of the property, near an abandoned well that hadn't been used in years, Deputy Marshal Raymond Foster noticed something protruding from the dried earth. Upon closer inspection, he stumbled backward, calling for the sheriff. It was a human hand, partially decomposed, the fingers locked in a position that suggested the final moments had been spent clawing at something, perhaps trying to escape, perhaps pleading for mercy. Over the following 72 hours, authorities would uncover more, much more. Body parts scattered across the 300-acre property like grotesque landmarks, a forearm buried beneath the chicken coop, sections of torso discovered in the hayloft of the main barn, and perhaps most disturbing, Nathaniel Blackwood's head, placed deliberately on a fence post overlooking the workers' quarters, eyes still open, mouth frozen in what witnesses described as an expression of absolute terror. The farm's 3 remaining workers, Henry Caldwell, Marcus Webb, and Daniel Foster, were immediately taken into custody. But their statements were identical, rehearsed to perfection, delivered with the kind of calm that made seasoned investigators deeply uncomfortable. They claimed to know nothing. They stated that Mr. Blackwood had been alive when they finished their work on the evening of April 20th, and that when they arrived the following morning, he had simply vanished. But the evidence told a different story, a story written in blood, suffering, and calculated vengeance, a story that newspapers of the time barely dared to print in full for fear of inciting similar acts among the laboring classes, a story that raises questions we still struggle to answer today. When does justice become revenge? When does oppression justify violence? And what happens to men when they are pushed beyond the limits of human endurance? This is the true account of the Blackwood Farm incident, pieced together from court documents, personal diaries, newspaper archives, and testimonies that were sealed for decades. What you're about to hear will disturb you. It should disturb you, because beneath the horror of what these men did lies an even greater horror, what was done to them first. To understand what happened at Blackwood Farm, we must first understand the world these men inhabited. Texas in 1921 was a land of extremes. The war had ended, but its scars remained visible everywhere. Thousands of young men had returned from the trenches of Europe. many of them broken in ways that had no name yet. Shell shock, we called it then. PTSD, we call it now. These men came home to find that the country they had fought for offered them little beyond low wages, grueling labor, and a social hierarchy that placed them firmly at the bottom. Rural Texas, in particular, was a place where power remained absolute and unquestioned. Large landowners controlled not just the land, but the lives of everyone who worked it. There were no labor unions in Travis County, no worker protections, no recourse for men who found themselves trapped in situations of systematic abuse. You worked, you obeyed, or you starved. It was that simple. Nathaniel Blackwood had inherited his farm from his father in 1903, by all accounts from Travis County land records. It was a modest operation. Nothing comparable to the massive cotton plantations further east, but substantial enough to require hired labor. Nathaniel had never married, had no children, and according to census records and correspondence archived at the Travis County Historical Society, he lived alone in the main farmhouse, a two-story structure that still stands today, though abandoned and deteriorating. Those who knew Nathaniel described him in vastly different ways depending on their social standing. To his peers, other landowners and businessmen in the nearby town of Manor, he was seen as a stern but fair man, someone who ran a tight operation and expected results. The Manor Gazette, in a brief obituary published weeks after his death, referred to him as a pillar of the agricultural community, a man who understood the value of discipline and hard work. But to those who worked under him, Nathaniel Blackwood was something else entirely, something far darker. Henry Caldwell arrived at Blackwood Farm in January of 1920, 14 months before the incident. He was 31 years old, a veteran of the Western Front who had served with the 36th Infantry Division. Military records show he was wounded twice, once by shrapnel near the Meuse-Argonne, and once by gas exposure that left his lungs permanently damaged. He returned to Texas, hoping to save enough money to buy a small plot of land of his own, to build a life with his young wife, Sarah, who was expecting their first child. The letters Henry sent to his brother in Houston paint a grim picture of life on the farm. In one letter dated March 1920, archived at the Houston Public Library's Special Collections, Henry writes, "The work is harder than anything I faced in France. We start before sunrise and finish after dark. Mr. Blackwood watches us constantly, and any mistake, no matter how small, results in docked pay or worse." Yesterday, Marcus dropped a sack of feed, and Mr. Blackwood struck him across the face with a leather strap. "We are not allowed to leave the property without permission. We sleep in a shed that leaks when it rains, but I endure it for Sarah and the child coming." Marcus Webb was 39, the oldest of the three workers. He had been at Blackwood Farm the longest, arriving in 1918. He was a widower, his wife having died during the influenza pandemic that swept through Texas that year. He had no family, no prospects, and nowhere else to go. Court testimony from the trial describes him as a quiet man, deeply religious, someone who attended church services in Manor whenever Nathaniel permitted it, which was rarely. Daniel Foster, at 23, was the youngest. He had not served in the war due to a childhood injury that left him with a pronounced limp. He arrived at Blackwood Farm in November 1920, desperate for any work after his family lost their small homestead to debt. Witnesses who knew Daniel before his time at the farm described him as cheerful and optimistic. Witnesses who saw him during the trial described a different person entirely, hollow-eyed, silent, and trembling. The farm itself was unremarkable in appearance. 300 acres of cotton fields, grazing land for cattle, a main house, a large barn, several outbuildings, and the workers' quarters, which was little more than a reinforced shed with 3 cots and a single wood-burning stove. Water had to be carried from a pump near the main house. There was no electricity in the workers' quarters, no insulation, no privacy, But it was what happened within these structures that matters. It was the culture of fear that Nathaniel cultivated, deliberately and methodically. According to testimony given during the preliminary hearings, Nathaniel kept a detailed ledger of infractions. Every mistake, every moment of perceived laziness, every instance of talking back was recorded, and each entry resulted in punishment. These punishments varied. Sometimes it was withheld wages. Sometimes it was additional hours of labor without compensation. Sometimes it was public humiliation, forcing a worker to stand in the midday sun for hours without water. And sometimes, according to multiple testimonies that were corroborated by physical evidence found later, it was violence. A journal entry from Henry Caldwell, discovered hidden beneath a floorboard in the workers' quarters, describes an incident from February 1921. Today, Mr. Blackwood accused Daniel of stealing food from the main house. Daniel denied it, said he was only taking what Mr. Blackwood had promised as part of our meals. Mr. Blackwood locked him in the root cellar for 2 days. We could hear him screaming. When he was released, he could barely walk. His hands were bloody from trying to claw through the door. The winter of 1920 to 1921 was particularly harsh in Travis County. Temperatures dropped below freezing multiple times, unusual for the region. The workers' quarters had inadequate heating, and requests for additional firewood or blankets were denied. Marcus Webb developed a severe cough that persisted for months. Henry's wife, Sarah, who had been living in a small room above the stable, grew increasingly ill as her pregnancy progressed. And then, in March of 1921, something happened that changed everything. Something that transformed simmering resentment into calculated rage. Something that made 3 desperate men decide that they had endured enough, and that justice, if it would not come from the law, would have to come from their own hands. Sarah Caldwell went into labor 3 weeks early, on the night of March 18th. It was a difficult birth, and complications arose quickly. Henry begged Nathaniel to allow him to take the wagon into Manor to fetch the doctor. Nathaniel refused, stating that he needed the wagon for a delivery the following morning, and that losing a night's sleep would impact the next day's work. He told Henry that women had been giving birth without doctors for thousands of years, and that Sarah would be fine. She wasn't fine. Sarah Caldwell died in that room above the stable, along with her unborn child, while Henry held her hand and begged for help that never came. She was 24 years old. 3 witnesses, neighbors from an adjacent property, testified that they saw Henry Caldwell kneeling in the dirt outside the stable the next morning, motionless, staring at nothing. They said he stayed there for hours, until Marcus and Daniel finally helped him to his feet and led him back to the workers' quarters. Nathaniel Blackwood, according to multiple accounts, showed no remorse. He docked Henry's pay for the day of mourning he took, and when Henry protested, Nathaniel threatened to have him removed from the property by force. That was March 19th, 1921. Exactly 1 month later, Nathaniel Blackwood would disappear, and the quiet, obedient workers he had brutalized for so long would become something else entirely. The days following Sarah Caldwell's death were marked by an eerie silence at Blackwood Farm. Neighbors who occasionally passed by the property noted that the usual sounds of farm work, the rhythmic chopping of wood, the calls between workers, the general activity that defined agricultural life, had diminished to almost nothing. One neighbor, Thomas Whitmore, who owned the adjacent cattle ranch, would later testify that he rode past the Blackwood property on April 15th and saw all 3 workers standing, motionless in the cotton field, not working, just standing there, staring toward the main house. When Thomas called out to them, asking if everything was all right, none of them responded. They simply turned and walked back toward the barn, moving in perfect synchronization, like men in a trance. Thomas found this disturbing enough to mention it to his wife that evening. but not disturbing enough to report to authorities. After all, what crime had been committed? Men standing in a field was hardly grounds for investigation. Nathaniel Blackwood was last seen alive on the evening of April 20th, 1921. This is confirmed by multiple sources. The local postmaster, Gerald Hutchins, spoke with Nathaniel that afternoon when he came to Manor to collect his mail. Gerald later described Nathaniel as being in good spirits, mentioning plans to expand his cotton acreage the following season. He returned to the farm around 4 in the afternoon, according to a delivery driver who passed him on the road. What happened after Nathaniel returned to Blackwood Farm remains officially a mystery. But piecing together various testimonies, physical evidence, and the fragments of information that emerged during the investigation, we can construct a timeline of events that is deeply disturbing. According to the workers' initial statements, given separately but nearly identical in content, Nathaniel arrived back at the farm and immediately began inspecting the day's work. He was displeased, though none of the workers could specify exactly what had displeased him. He announced that their evening meal would be reduced as punishment for substandard work. He then retired to the main house around 6 in the evening, as was his custom. The workers claimed they ate their meager dinner, consisting of cornbread and beans, in the workers' quarters, and then went to sleep around 8. They heard nothing unusual during the night. When they woke the following morning and went to begin their work, Nathaniel did not emerge from the main house to give them their assignments, which was highly unusual. His routine was rigid, and he was always awake before dawn. By mid-morning, with still no sign of Nathaniel, Henry Caldwell knocked on the door of the main house. No answer. He knocked again, louder this time, still nothing. The door was unlocked, which the workers found strange, as Nathaniel always locked his doors at night. Henry entered the house, calling out for Mr. Blackwood. The house was empty. Nathaniel's bed had been slept in, or at least appeared to have been. His boots were by the door, his coat hung on its usual hook, but Nathaniel himself was gone. This is where the workers' story begins to fracture under scrutiny. They claim they searched the property, calling for him, checking the barn, the fields, even the old well. They found nothing. At around noon on April 21st, they decided to walk to the neighboring Whitmore Ranch to report that their employer had vanished. Thomas Whitmore, upon hearing this news, immediately rode back to Blackwood Farm with the 3 workers. He conducted his own search of the property and, like them, found no trace of Nathaniel Blackwood. It was Thomas who decided to alert Sheriff Burke, riding into Manor that evening to file a missing person report. Sheriff Coleman Burke was a veteran lawman who had served Travis County for over 15 years. He was known as thorough, intelligent, and deeply skeptical of convenient stories. When he arrived at Blackwood Farm on the morning of April 22nd with 2 deputies, he began a methodical investigation of the property. The main house revealed nothing immediately suspicious. Nathaniel's personal effects were in order. There was no sign of struggle, no blood, no indication of forced entry or violence. His horse was still in the stable, well fed and calm. His rifle, which he kept above the fireplace, remained in its place. If Nathaniel had left the property, he had done so on foot, in the middle of the night, without his coat, without his horse, and without telling anyone where he was going. Sheriff Burke interviewed the 3 workers separately. Their stories matched perfectly, too perfectly in Burke's opinion. He noted in his official report, preserved at the Travis County Sheriff's Department archives, that the men seemed rehearsed, that they answered questions with the exact same phrasing as if they had practiced. But there was no evidence of foul play, and Texas law required more than suspicion to make an arrest. The search continued throughout April 22nd, expanding to include volunteers from Manor and neighboring properties. They searched the fields, the outbuildings, the surrounding woods. They found nothing. As the sun began to set, Sheriff Burke made the decision to continue the search the following morning. That night, April 22nd to 23rd, is when things took a darker turn. At approximately 11 o'clock at night, Sarah Whitmore, Thomas's wife, was awakened by sounds coming from the direction of Blackwood Farm. Their ranch bordered the Blackwood property, and on quiet nights, sounds could carry across the distance. She described the sounds in her testimony as screaming. Not the screaming of someone in immediate danger, she clarified, but the screaming of someone in prolonged agony. Horrible, animal screams that rose and fell, lasted for several minutes, then stopped abruptly. She woke her husband. Thomas listened, and he heard it too. But by the time he had dressed and prepared to ride over to investigate, the screaming had stopped. The night had returned to silence. Thomas decided to wait until morning, reasoning that if it was an emergency, surely someone would come seeking help. No one did. I want to pause here and ask you something. Tell us in the comments what you think was happening at Blackwood Farm that night. Was Nathaniel still alive? Were the workers innocent, or had they already set their plan in motion? Your theories matter because this case hinges on interpretation, on reading between the lines of official statements and documented evidence. The following morning, April 23rd, Sheriff Burke returned to Blackwood Farm with his deputies to continue the search. The 3 workers were present, beginning their daily tasks as if nothing was amiss. When Burke asked if they had heard anything unusual during the night, all 3 stated they had slept soundly and heard nothing. It was Deputy Marshal Raymond Foster who made the first discovery. While searching the eastern section of the property, near an abandoned well that had been covered with rotting wooden boards, he noticed that the boards had been disturbed. Fresh dirt had been scattered around the well's perimeter, and protruding from the dirt, barely visible, was a human hand. The hand was pale, the fingers curled into a rigid claw. Decomposition had already begun, suggesting death had occurred at least 24 to 48 hours prior. But what shocked Deputy Foster most was not the hand itself, but what he saw when he looked closer. The fingernails were torn and bloody, as if the person had been clawing desperately at something in their final moments. Sheriff Burke was called over immediately. He ordered his deputies to carefully excavate the area around the hand. What they uncovered was only a forearm, severed cleanly at the elbow. No body, just the arm. And wrapped around the wrist was a distinctive silver watch that Thomas Whitmore immediately identified as belonging to Nathaniel Blackwood. Burke ordered an immediate halt to all work on the farm. He placed the 3 workers under watch, though not yet under arrest, and summoned additional men from Manor to conduct a comprehensive search of every inch of the property. What they would find over the next 72 hours would confirm Burke's worst suspicions and transform a missing person case into one of the most disturbing murder investigations in Texas history, because the hand near the well was only the beginning. Nathaniel Blackwood had not simply been killed. He had been systematically dismembered, and his remains had been scattered across the farm like grotesque warnings. Each discovery was more horrifying than the last, and each one pointed to a level of rage and planning that suggested this was no crime of passion, but something calculated, ritualistic, and deeply personal. And at the center of it all were 3 men who maintained their innocence with unsettling calm, even as the evidence mounted around them. 3 men who had suffered under Nathaniel Blackwood's cruelty for so long that perhaps, in their minds, what they had done was not murder at all, but justice finally served. The question that haunted Sheriff Burke, and that haunts this case to this day, is simple. What exactly happened in that barn on the night of April 20th? Because witnesses would later come forward, stating they had seen light flickering in the barn's windows long after dark, and that they had heard sounds. Not screams, not yet, but the sounds of men working, of something being dragged, of metal striking wood. Sounds that, in retrospect, painted a picture of something terrible unfolding in the darkness. The search of Blackwood Farm, that began on April 23rd, would continue for 5 days. What started as a missing person investigation transformed into a macabre treasure hunt, with each discovery more disturbing than the last. Sheriff Burke divided the property into sections, assigning teams of deputies and volunteers to methodically comb through every structure, every field, every possible hiding place. The second discovery came on the afternoon of April 23rd, just hours after the severed forearm was found near the well. A volunteer named Robert Chen, searching through the chicken coop behind the main house, noticed that the dirt floor in one corner appeared freshly disturbed. The chickens had been behaving strangely, he noted, clustering in the opposite corner and refusing to approach that area. When Robert began to dig, his shovel struck something solid approximately 2 feet down. It was another piece of Nathaniel Blackwood, portions of his torso, wrapped carefully in burlap sacking, buried in a shallow grave beneath the very coop where his chickens laid eggs each morning. The flesh showed signs of violence, deep lacerations that coroners would later determine were made by farming implements, axes and sickles, tools the workers would have had easy access to. But what disturbed investigators most was the methodical nature of it all. Whoever had done this had not acted in frenzied rage. They had taken their time. They had carved carefully. They had planned where each piece would be hidden, creating a map of horror across the property that Nathaniel had once ruled with absolute authority. The barn yielded the next discovery. The massive structure which housed equipment, hay and livestock during harsh weather had been thoroughly cleaned, too thoroughly. The dirt floor had been swept, the tools organized with precision that multiple witnesses stated was unlike the workers' usual habits. But in the hayloft, hidden beneath several layers of fresh hay that had been recently stacked, Deputy Foster found a wooden crate. Inside the crate were more remains, sections of limbs, carefully arranged, almost ceremonially. And beneath them, wrapped in oilcloth to preserve it, was a leather journal. The journal belonged to Nathaniel Blackwood. Its pages contained entries dating back to 1918, when Marcus Webb first arrived at the farm. Page after page documented punishments administered, infractions recorded, and most chilling of all, future punishments planned in meticulous detail. One entry, dated February 14, 1921, read, "Henry Caldwell continues to show defiance in subtle ways. His requests for better conditions for his pregnant wife demonstrate a fundamental misunderstanding of his position. I have decided that after the child is born, I will reduce his wages by half and extend his contract by an additional year. This will teach him the consequences of entitlement. If he protests, I will ensure he finds no work anywhere in Travis County." Another entry from March 3, 1921. "Marcus Webb's cough grows worse. He is becoming less productive. I suspect he is exaggerating his illness to avoid full days of work. Tomorrow I will require him to work a double shift without breaks. If he is truly ill, this will make it evident. If he is malingering, this will correct the behavior." The journal revealed a mind that viewed the workers not as human beings, but as property to be controlled, punished and exploited without limit. Sheriff Burke would later state in his official report that reading Nathaniel's journal made him physically ill, that it depicted a level of casual cruelty that even hardened lawmen found difficult to comprehend. But the journal's final entry was the most significant. Dated April 20th, 1921, the day Nathaniel disappeared, it read, "The men are growing sullen and quiet. They no longer meet my eyes when I give instructions. I suspect they are planning to leave, perhaps to seek work elsewhere. I have decided to implement new measures to ensure their compliance. Tomorrow morning, I will inform them that I'm extending their contracts indefinitely, and that any attempt to leave the property will result in criminal charges for breach of contract and theft of wages owed. I have already spoken with Judge Pemberton, who has assured me of his support in this matter. They will learn that there is no escape from their obligations. That final entry was never executed, because April 20th was the night that Nathaniel Blackwood's reign of terror ended, violently and completely. On April 25th, 2 days into the intensive search, investigators made a discovery in the barn that would fundamentally change their understanding of what had transpired. Deputy Marshal Foster, conducting a second, more thorough examination of the structure, noticed inconsistencies in the barn's wooden wall near the back corner. Several boards appeared newer than others, and the nails holding them in place showed no signs of rust or age. When these boards were pried away, they revealed a small hidden space, approximately 4 feet wide and 6 feet deep, carved into the wall between the barn's interior and exterior. It was barely large enough for a man to stand in. And inside this space, investigators found evidence that turned their stomachs. Bloodstains covered the wooden walls, floor, and ceiling of the hidden compartment. Not splattered, but smeared, as if someone had been confined in this tiny space and had struggled violently, their blood painting every surface they came in contact with. Chemical analysis performed by the Travis County coroner confirmed the blood was human, and the volume suggested massive trauma. Carved into one of the wooden walls, barely visible beneath the layers of dried blood, were words. Scratched desperately with what appeared to be fingernails, the message read, "God forgive me. God forgive them. God forgive us all." But perhaps most disturbing were the tools found hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the main section of the barn, a collection of farming implements, saws, axes, pruning shears and knives, all meticulously cleaned but showing microscopic traces of blood and tissue when examined under magnification. These were the instruments used to dismember Nathaniel Blackwood, and they had been hidden carefully, methodically, suggesting the workers had planned to continue their normal routines as if nothing had happened. Fragments of rope were discovered attached to support beams in the barn, cut cleanly but showing signs of strain and wear. The rope matched material used commonly on farms for securing livestock. Forensic examination revealed tiny fibers embedded in the rope consistent with human skin and hair. The implication was clear. Nathaniel had been restrained here, tied to these beams, unable to escape what was coming. A large wooden table, typically used for sorting equipment and supplies, showed deep gouge marks and staining consistent with it having been used as a butcher's block. Beneath the table, despite thorough cleaning attempts, investigators found traces of bone fragments and tissue that had seeped between the wooden planks. Thomas Whitmore, when shown these discoveries, confirmed that the screaming his wife had heard on the night of April 22nd had come from the direction of the barn. The timeline was beginning to solidify. Nathaniel had been taken on April 20th, likely in the evening after he returned to the main house. He had been brought to the barn, restrained, and over the course of that night, and possibly into April 21st, he had been subjected to prolonged suffering before finally being killed and dismembered. The 3 workers, Henry, Caldwell, Marcus Webb, and Daniel Foster, were formally arrested on April 26th and charged with first-degree murder. They were transported to the Travis County Jail in Manor, held in separate cells and interrogated extensively. Their stories never changed. They maintained absolute ignorance of what had happened to Nathaniel Blackwood, but physical evidence told a different story. When their clothing was examined, microscopic blood traces were found on all 3 men's work shirts and trousers. When their hands were inspected, Henry Caldwell had fresh calluses and blisters, consistent with prolonged use of saws and axes. Marcus Webb had defensive wounds on his forearms, small cuts and scrapes that he could not adequately explain. Daniel Foster had splinters embedded in his palms, wood fragments that matched the boards used to construct the hidden compartment in the barn. Sheriff Burke conducted the interrogations personally, spending hours with each man, trying to break through their unified wall of silence. The transcripts of these interrogations, preserved in the Travis County Legal Archives, reveal a psychological chess match between a determined investigator and three men who had clearly prepared for this moment. Henry Caldwell was interrogated first. Burke began gently, expressing sympathy for the loss of Henry's wife and child, acknowledging the terrible circumstances that had brought him to this point. Henry remained calm throughout, his hands folded on the table. Between them, his eyes never leaving Burke's face. When Burke asked directly if Henry had killed Nathaniel Blackwood, Henry's response was measured. "Sheriff, I am not a violent man. I served my country in the war. I've seen enough death to last a lifetime. All I wanted was to work honest labor, save money, and build a life with my wife. Mr. Blackwood took that from me, but I did not kill him. I could not kill any man, no matter what he'd done." Burke pressed further, asking about the night of April 20th. What had Henry done after dinner? Where had he been? Henry's answer was consistent with his previous statements. He had eaten, retired to the workers' quarters, and slept through the night. He had heard nothing unusual. He had seen nothing unusual. But when Burke presented the physical evidence, the blood traces on Henry's clothing, the calluses on his hands, Henry's composure finally cracked, just slightly. His jaw tightened, his eyes grew distant, and he said something that Burke would remember for the rest of his life. "Sometimes, Sheriff, justice doesn't come from courts. Sometimes it comes from men who've had enough. That's not a confession. That's just a fact about the world." Marcus Webb's interrogation revealed even less. He was older, more experienced in remaining silent under pressure. He answered every question with the minimum words necessary, never elaborating, never offering information that wasn't explicitly requested. When confronted with evidence, he simply stated that he could not explain it, but that he had not harmed Mr. Blackwood. However, near the end of the interrogation, Burke asked Marcus a different kind of question. He asked if Marcus felt any remorse for what had happened to Nathaniel, regardless of who was responsible. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, then said, "Sheriff, I'll tell you what I feel. I feel like maybe there's a kind of justice in this world that's older than any law you enforce. I feel like maybe when a man treats other men like animals, he should not be surprised when they respond as animals do. That's all I'll say about it." Daniel Foster was the youngest, and Burke hoped he might be the most vulnerable to pressure. But Daniel proved just as resolute as his companions. He claimed ignorance, repeated the same timeline of events, and offered no explanations for the inconsistencies in the evidence. When Burke suggested that cooperating might lead to leniency, that the youngest among them might receive mercy if he told the truth, Daniel simply shook his head and said, "There's three of us, Sheriff. Whatever you think happened, you'll have to prove it to all three, because we're in this together, whatever this is." That statement, that acknowledgement of unity among the three men, was perhaps the closest any of them came to confession. They were bound together by circumstance, by shared suffering, and now by shared guilt. They would stand together or fall together. On April 28th, Sheriff Burke made the decision to charge all three men with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and desecration of human remains. The trial was set for June 1921. The evidence was overwhelming, circumstantial, but damning. The physical traces, the timeline, the motive, and the methods all pointed to a coordinated act of revenge carried out by three desperate men who had finally reached their breaking point. But as the trial approached, something unexpected began to happen in Travis. county and beyond, public opinion started to shift. Newspapers began publishing excerpts from Nathaniel's journal, the detailed accounts of abuse and cruelty. People read about Sarah Caldwell's death, about the inhumane conditions the workers had endured, about the systematic torture that Nathaniel had inflicted on men who had no power to defend themselves. And slowly, quietly, a question began to emerge. Were these men truly murderers, or were they victims who had simply fought back the only way they knew how? The trial of Henry Caldwell, Marcus Webb, and Daniel Foster concluded on June 24, 1921. After 3 weeks of testimony, evidence presentation, and passionate arguments from both prosecution and defense, the jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Their verdict shocked the courtroom, not guilty on all charges. The jury foreman, when asked by reporters how they had reached this decision despite overwhelming physical evidence, stated simply, "We could not, in good conscience, convict men for actions that any of us might have taken under similar circumstances. The law failed to protect these workers. What happened at Blackwood Farm was a tragedy, but it was not murder. It was desperation." The 3 men walked free that summer day, returning to lives forever marked by what had occurred. But the story of Blackwood Farm did not end with the trial. In fact, in many ways, it was only beginning. Over the decades that followed, new information emerged, hidden, truths surfaced, and the full scope of what happened that April night in 1921 slowly revealed itself through fragments of evidence that time had tried to bury. In 1952, 31 years after the incident, a renovation crew working on the old Blackwood farmhouse, which had changed ownership 3 times since Nathaniel's death, made a disturbing discovery. Behind a false wall in the basement, sealed away and forgotten, they found a metal lockbox containing additional journals and correspondence that had never been presented at the trial. These documents, donated to the Travis County Historical Society in 1953, revealed that Nathaniel's cruelty had been even more systematic than previously known. Letters to other landowners discussed methods of controlling labor, of breaking workers' spirits, of ensuring complete obedience through calculated psychological torture. One letter, dated January 1921, to a fellow farm owner in Williamson County, described in clinical detail how to create dependency, pay them just enough to survive but never enough to leave, keep them isolated from town, monitor their correspondence, make them believe that no one else will hire them, that they are worthless beyond your property. Fear is the most effective management tool available. But perhaps most significant was a document dated April 19, 1921, just 1 day before Nathaniel disappeared. It was a legal contract, drafted by Nathaniel and prepared for the workers to sign the following morning. The contract extended their employment indefinitely, reduced their already meager wages by 40%, and included clauses that would have essentially made them indentured servants, legally bound to the property with no means of escape. This document was never signed, because on the night of April 20th, before Nathaniel could enforce this final act of enslavement, the workers had acted. In 1967, an elderly woman named Margaret Foster, Daniel Foster's widow, came forward with information she had kept secret for 46 years. She was terminally ill, suffering from cancer, and felt compelled to share the truth before she died. In a deathbed confession recorded by her granddaughter, Margaret revealed that Daniel had told her everything in 1965, just before his own death from heart failure. According to Margaret's account, the 3 workers had not acted spontaneously. They had planned Nathaniel's death for weeks, ever since Sarah Caldwell's funeral. They had discussed it in whispers, late at night in the workers' quarters, weighing their options, knowing that legal avenues offered no protection or justice. They had concluded that Nathaniel would never stop, that his cruelty would only escalate, and that if they did not act, They would either die on that farm or spend their entire lives as slaves to his brutality. On the evening of April 20th, they had waited until Nathaniel completed his evening inspection and retired to the main house. Around midnight, they had approached the house silently. The door was unlocked, as Nathaniel felt secure in his absolute authority over his workers, never imagining they would dare to enter unbidden. They found him asleep in his bed. What happened next, Margaret stated, was not quick, it was not merciful. The three men had woken Nathaniel, bound him, and carried him to the barn. There, according to Daniel's confession to his wife, they had confronted him with every crime he had committed against them, every act of cruelty, every moment of suffering he had caused. They had shown him Sarah's letters, read aloud passages where she described her fear and pain during her difficult pregnancy. They had listed each punishment, each humiliation, each act of violence. And then, according to this confession, they had given Nathaniel a choice. He could write a confession, admitting to his abuse, promising restitution to the families of those he had harmed, and agreeing to free them from their contracts. Or he could face consequences. Nathaniel, even bound and helpless, had refused. He had spat at them, cursed them, promised that he would see them all hanged. He maintained, even in those final hours, that he had every right to treat his workers as he saw fit, that they were his property in all but name, and that they deserved everything he had done to them. It was this final defiance, this absolute refusal to acknowledge their humanity, that sealed his fate. What the three men did to Nathaniel Blackwood over the course of that long night was, in their minds, not murder, but justice. They made him feel every ounce of pain he had inflicted on others. They ensured his death was slow, agonizing, and filled with the same terror that he had instilled in them for years. Margaret's confession was never officially investigated. By 1967, all three workers were deceased. Henry Caldwell had died in 1959 from complications related to his war injuries. Marcus Webb had passed away in 1962 from pneumonia, the same chronic cough that had plagued him since his time at Blackwood Farm, finally claiming his life. Daniel Foster died in 1965. Sheriff Coleman Burke had long since retired. The case was considered closed, a dark chapter in Texas history that most people preferred to forget. But in 1978, a graduate student named Patricia Alvarez from the University of Texas at Austin was researching labor conditions in rural Texas during the early 20th century. While examining property records and archived newspapers, she uncovered something that added yet another layer to the Blackwood Farm story. She discovered that Nathaniel Blackwood was not the first owner of that property to die under mysterious circumstances. His father, William Blackwood, who had owned the farm from 1878 until his death in 1903, had also been found dead under strange conditions. Official records listed the cause of death as accidental, stating that William had fallen from the barn's hayloft and broken his neck. But newspaper accounts from the time mentioned that several workers had left the property abruptly just days before William's death, and that there had been whispered rumors of foul play that were never officially investigated. Patricia's research suggested a disturbing pattern. Blackwood Farm had been a place of abuse and violence for generations. The cruelty that Henry, Marcus, and Daniel had experienced was not an anomaly, but a tradition, passed from father to son, a legacy of brutality that had finally been broken in 1921. In 1981, the final piece of the puzzle emerged, a box of personal effects belonging to Henry Caldwell, stored in his brother's attic in Houston for 60 years, was discovered by Henry's great-niece during an estate sale. Among the items was a letter written by Henry and sealed in an envelope marked, "To be opened only after my death." The letter, now housed at the Texas State Archives, is a full confession. Written in Henry's neat, careful handwriting, it describes in detail the events of April 20th through April 23rd, 1921. It confirms everything that Margaret Foster had revealed in her deathbed confession, but it also includes something more: justification. Henry wrote, "I have lived with what we did for 38 years. I have prayed for forgiveness, sought redemption, and tried to be a better man than the one I was that night. But I will not lie and say I regret it. I regret that the world made it necessary. I regret that no law, no authority, no power would protect us from a man like Nathaniel Blackwood. I regret that we had to become the very violence we despised in order to survive. But I do not regret that he is dead, and I believe with everything in my soul that we did what any men would do when pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. History may judge us, God may judge us, but we judged ourselves long ago, and we carry that weight every day of our lives." The letter concludes with a request that future generations understand that the men at Blackwood Farm were not monsters, but human beings who made an impossible choice in an impossible situation. That they not be remembered for what they did to Nathaniel Blackwood, but for what was done to them that made such actions seem like the only path forward. These fragments, discovered across 6 decades, paint a complete picture of what happened at Blackwood Farm. But they also raise questions that remain unanswered. Questions about justice, morality, and the limits of human endurance. Today, more than a century after the events at Blackwood Farm, the property still stands in Travis County, Texas. The main house is abandoned, its windows shattered, its roof caving in from decades of neglect. The barn where Nathaniel Blackwood met his end has partially collapsed, its wooden beams rotting into the Texas soil. The workers' quarters were torn down in the 1970s. Nature has begun to reclaim what was once a functioning farm, and most people who drive past it on the rural highway don't know the dark history hidden beneath those collapsing structures. But the story refuses to die. Local historians continue to debate the case. True crime enthusiasts dissect the evidence, and moral philosophers use Blackwood Farm as a case study in the ethics of violence, revenge, and justice. Because at its core, this story asks a question that has no easy answer. What do we do when the systems designed to protect us fail completely? There are several theories about what really happened at Blackwood Farm, and the truth likely lies somewhere in the intersection of all of them. Theory 1. Justified homicide. This perspective, held by many who have studied the case, argues that Henry Caldwell, Marcus Webb, and Daniel Foster were victims who fought back against an abuser, that Nathaniel Blackwood's systematic cruelty created a situation where violence became the only form of self-defense available. Proponents of this theory point to the journal entries, the death of Sarah Caldwell, and the indentured servitude contract as evidence that the workers faced a genuine threat to their lives and freedom. They argue that what happened in the barn was not murder, but an act of desperate survival. Theory 2. Premeditated murder driven by rage. This interpretation suggests that while the workers had legitimate grievances, their response crossed all moral and legal boundaries. That they could have left the farm, sought help from authorities in neighboring counties, or found other solutions that didn't involve torture and dismemberment. This theory emphasizes the calculated nature of the crime, the weeks of planning revealed in Margaret Foster's confession, and the ritualistic way Nathaniel's body was scattered across the property. It argues that regardless of provocation, what the 3 men did was inexcusable. Theory 3. Collective psychological break. Some psychologists who have examined the case suggest that the 3 workers experienced a form of collective trauma response, a psychological break caused by prolonged abuse, isolation, and the trigger of Sarah Caldwell's death. This theory posits that they were not entirely in control of their actions, that years of psychological torture had fundamentally altered their ability to reason morally. It's a controversial theory as it removes agency from the workers, but it attempts to explain how three men with no previous history of violence could commit such a brutal act. What we know for certain is this: three men suffered under conditions that no human being should endure. One man died violently because he refused to see those beneath him as worthy of basic dignity, and a jury of their peers decided that the law, as written, could not adequately address the moral complexity of the situation. The Blackwood Farm case has influenced discussions about workers' rights, about the limits of employer authority, and about what constitutes justifiable use of force in self-defense. Texas labor laws were reformed in the decades following the trial, partially in response to the public outcry that the case generated. Protections were put in place, oversight was increased, and the absolute power that men like Nathaniel Blackwood once held was gradually diminished. But to this day, no one knows the complete truth of what happened in that barn on April 20th, 1921. We have confessions written decades after the fact. We have physical evidence that tells part of the story. We have testimony from men who took their secrets to the grave. But we will never know exactly what was said, what was felt, what passed between Nathaniel Blackwood and the three workers during those final hours. Perhaps that's fitting. Perhaps some truths are too dark to be fully illuminated, too complex to be reduced to simple narratives of good and evil. What happened at Blackwood Farm was a tragedy in every sense of the word. A tragedy of systemic failure, of human cruelty, and of desperate men, driven to desperate acts. The farm sits empty now, a monument to violence on both sides. Local teenagers claim it's haunted, that you can hear screaming coming from the ruins of the barn on certain nights. Whether those claims are true or simply the product of overactive imaginations fed by dark history, I cannot say. But I can tell you this. The story of Blackwood Farm is a reminder that the monsters we fear are not always supernatural. Sometimes they wear human faces, sometimes they hold power over our lives, and sometimes, when pushed far enough, ordinary men become capable of extraordinary darkness. Thank you for joining me on this journey into one of Texas's most disturbing historical cases. If this story affected you, if it made you think about justice, morality, and the human capacity for both cruelty and survival, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe to our haunted community and hit that notification bell because we have many more forgotten stories to explore together. Stories that challenge us, disturb us, and remind us that the past is never as far away as we'd like to believe. Until next time, remember, history is written by the survivors, and sometimes the survivors are the ones we least expect.